Hello and welcome, Reality Sandwich community. We're here with another Share Your Experience today. My name is Holly. I'm one of the conscious agents with Reality Sandwich, and I am joined by Jen today. Thank you so much for being here, Jen. I'm
Thanks for
really
having
looking
me.
forward to this conversation. Tell us a little about yourself here before we get into it.
Sure. So my name's Jen, and I live in Central Virginia, originally from right outside of Philadelphia, a little suburb. For work, I do primarily customer support, and I worked for 20 years for a small statue catalog company where we imported religious statuary from Calcutta. Greek, Norse, Hindu, Buddhist. We had the deity for you, and that was a really
Interesting.
cool. Yeah, it was a really
Yeah.
cool experience. And then the last 5 years, I worked for in the health and wellness sector for a dieting app, and taking a little bit of a break right now, a little bit of a career pivot, and trying to figure things out. I'm an advocate for volunteering. I'm a end of life doula and a certified dementia practitioner, and I do hospice volunteer work, and then also work with a nonprofit that helps children who have recently lost family members and help them kind of navigate grief. Um, and then and then a little bit different, but you haven't done it for a while. I did some disaster response work post Katrina, post Harvey, and getting ready to do a post Helene trip down in North Carolina.
This is big work.
It is. It is. It is. I kind of always kept my professional work and what I did to pay the bills separate from my volunteer work. Because I know how draining that kind of work can be when you're doing it for a living. And yeah, I've just kind of always felt called to serve. So it's very rewarding. I'm constantly feeling like I'm getting more out of it than the people that I'm helping.
Mhm.
When I do the disaster response trips, I usually just go out for a week, and I call it my poor man's spiritual retreat, because it's just amazing to kind of be in a place where, you're helping and you're not thinking about your problems, and you're really helping put your own problems in perspective and realizing that things can't be too bad when you're mucking out somebody's house that got flooded.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great way to gain some incredible perspective.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, okay, so today we're going back in the Wayback Machine
Mhm.
to the 90s, one of my favorite times. And you are going to share a little bit about an LSD experience, which I'm excited to hear about because A, it's my favorite substance, and B, I love hearing about people's early experiences with psychedelics because while I feel like as we get older and start like maybe experimenting or using plant medicines more intentionally, there's a lot of growth there, but
Yeah.
I think that there, when you experience some of these things in your youth, it's like the wonder of stuff happening and experiencing for the first time, right? Our minds are expanding, the world is still new. So I think there's something really incredible about the magic of positive psychedelic experiences when we're younger. So I'm excited to hear about this. Yeah, take it away. Tell me, paint a picture for me. Where were you? What was happening? What'd you learn? Like,
Right. So yeah, so it was
get
back
into this.
back in the early 90s. It feels like it's forever. So I was teenager, 16, 17 years old, and started getting into the whole Grateful Dead scene. Jerry was still alive, and and Dead Tour and Little Tour Rats were crawling all over the place, and I was no exception. Growing up in the suburb of Philadelphia, and really feeling my hippie roots and hippie vibes, and not exclusively Grateful Dead. I was a little edgier, like I really liked the Doors, and I was into punk for a while. But at any rate, it was around that time that I you know it started experimenting with psychedelic medicine. And when I was 17, started you know I think primarily with LSD. And what really kind of makes me feel so incredibly fortunate is that I don't know if it was the avenue of, the dead culture and community, or just the people that I was friends with and the older people I was friends with, but I really was introduced to this, medicine in a way that was just so incredibly organic. And, like for instance, I intuitively understood that it was not a party drug, and it was not something that it was one of the few things that when you do it, you come back with something. And that psychedelic medicine was the only thing that you could do that with in terms of drugs. I knew to be outside. I was a big advocate. I was not one of those, teenagers who just wants to sit inside and watch the curtains breathe and giggle. Like I was climbing trees. I was walking through the woods. I was in rivers. I just really needed to immerse, have movement. And at this particular time that I had, wrote in about, I was, typical 17-year-old, heartbroken and just kind of, chasing after the wrong guy and not very confident with who I was, had dropped out of high school. And, was kind of going through a depression, which at the time, we weren't even in the early 90s, we weren't really calling it that, it was just, and I think for the most part, I just figured like this is what adolescence is, right? Like every 17-year-old is like, not getting out of bed every day. Um, and this one particular LSD trip that I took, I remember it was at my home growing up, and it was a couple of friends. And that's a side note too. I always understood to only do this, do LSD or psilocybin at the time with other people who were doing it, and to make it a point not to be around other people who weren't, or who were on different things or just drinking or whatever.
Right.
And that was very important to me and my, group of friends to do. And, we were up all night and we were walking around the block of this, neighborhood that I essentially grew up in, and it was like it wasn't like an out of body experience. It was more like I had the ability to kind of see who I was outside of myself. And when you're a teenager, your head's so far up your ass. That's almost impossible to do. And I'm not even going to limit that to teenagers, because I know grown ass adults who are twice that age who can't do that either. But um, I really looked at myself and I didn't like what I saw. And I think because I was walking with my very close friends, I kind of saw myself through their eyes. And I thought to myself, you're miserable. And you're a miserable person to be around. And you don't have to be this way. And, like where do you want to go? What do you want to do? And wasn't even like this voice. I could feel that it was myself. And it was just the LSD gave me that perspective to be able. And then the next day, I mean, again, it's as I'm learning more about, psychedelic assisted therapy in a clinical sort of way, and hearing about integration and hearing about, the neuroplasticity of the next day or the next couple of days, and feeling so incredibly fortunate that I was able to experience that in a very natural, intuitive, organic way as a child, as a teenager, a minor. And, that particular trip was able to, think about this the next day and wake up and be like, you're right. I don't want to be that person anymore. I don't need to be that person anymore. I've only been on this planet for the last 17 years. I've got a whole lifetime ahead of me, and I don't need to wallow in this misery. And really, that was like a very pivotal point for me to kind of start to make that shift and to not be depressed, and to come back and really kind of see the beauty in all things, and kind of carry that with me, even when I wasn't in a psychedelic state. So it was big. It was big medicine.
Yeah. Was this like, do you feel like this was almost like a collective experience among you and your friends, or your friends like kind of vibing on their own wave and you're like over here having this like
Oh yeah.
existential
No,
moment?
I was completely on my own. As I recall, it was, I think they were just kind of chattering back and forth to each other. And I was kind of like a little bit behind them, and being quiet and really kind of sitting with my own thoughts. And a lot of times, during that time period, again, I was very insecure. I had acne, and I didn't like who I was, and or how I looked. When I would do LSD or psilocybin, I specifically would not. Um, I tried like if I had to use the bathroom, I would literally like run into the bathroom and use the bathroom, and or I would tell my friends specifically, if I'm in there for more than 5 minutes, please come and get me, because I would start you know looking in the mirror and going like, I can't believe all these pores,
Yeah.
and
Never look
really,
in the mirror. We all
yeah,
know that
I
rule.
know, I know. So yeah, it was just, so for the next, couple, like I would say from 17 to about 19, yeah, I didn't do it a lot, although, on Dead Tour, truth be told, I mean, it was a lot of kids did eat it like it was candy. And, I did either LSD or psilocybin, at least a couple times a week. And, going right before, we'd go in to see the show or whatnot. But I also did it a lot, on my own with my friends in the woods, and really, like I said, it was amazing how much I was able to integrate at such a young age.
Yeah.
I have another memory of when about a year later, after I had been, experiencing, taking not on a regular basis, but, probably had about 15 or 20 trips, under my belt at that point. And it was Mother's Day weekend. I was 18 years old, and some friends and I, again, took some LSD and went to this park, and we were laying on a floating dock. It was the day before Mother's Day, and we were laying on a floating dock, and I was just, it was, sunny out, and I was feeling the sunshine. And I had so much gratitude towards my mother, who was a wonderful, wonderful woman, a wonderful mom. And I had this feeling almost like a flashback laying on the floating dock, a feeling like I was in the womb, and feeling just this love and this protection. And again, like I look back now, it to me was the most natural thing in the world at 18 to experience. And I'm looking back at it now, and with my knowledge of, of psychedelic medicine, and just going, wow, how incredibly fortunate I was to experience that. A funny part of that story is that the next day, on Mother's Day, I hand wrote a card for my mother. And because I was a very candid child, and she knew about my shenanigans. I told her about the whole entire experience, and I remember writing to her and you're like, now, Mom, I know that you think psychedelics are a bad thing. Cause, but I mean, it might as well have been heroin in her
Oh
book,
yeah,
like it was,
totally, totally.
but I, explained to her that feeling that I had, and, and just being so grateful. And and just writing to her, like, now don't worry about me, and please understand that I'm using this in a really responsible way. And if anything, it's making me just so incredibly grateful that you're my mother, and you've been so amazing. And I'm sorry I give you so much shit. And thank you, thank you for this life. And I've had that sort of appreciation towards her and towards the life that she's given me, I think, since then.
How was that perceived? Like, how did she take that letter? What was her response to this?
Oh, she was very worried about her daughter for a very long time.
I mean, because like on the one hand, like what mother does not want like a heartfelt letter from her teenage daughter, right? Like that's like a holy grail for like
Yeah,
parents
yeah.
of
I
a
mean,
teenage
saying
girl.
like,
But
"Thank you
again, at the
for your
same
life."
time, right? It's like, okay, my kid's high on yeah, like this series. It's like I can see that getting mixed reviews.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Bless her heart. She took it in stride.
Yeah,
Like it's not like I got in trouble or anything like that, or I
yeah.
got like a lecture. I mean, at this point in the game, she realized she always worried about me. She always, and was concerned about my drug use, but I think she got me. She always
Mhm.
did get me. So I think on some level, the mom part of her, was worried sick. And also probably wish that I wasn't so incredibly honest and candor with her about these
Yeah.
experiences.
Don't
I
give
could
me more things to stress about, child. Like, yeah.
I know. I could have given her just like a really nice Mother's Day card that said, I am so incredibly fortunate and grateful for the life that you've given me. I could have just ended it there, but nah, that's not my MO.
Like, no, no, no. You need the full version of this, unfiltered. Like, here is how I have arrived at this conclusion.
Yeah, exactly,
I
exactly.
mean, that's a beautiful gift, though, to have a parent that also just gets you and that you were able to feel comfortable enough to even like say that, like in another scenario, like some parents would be like, and you're going to rehab, or like extreme scenarios. Like that's a beautiful thing to have.
Yeah, for sure, for sure.
You're a mother yourself?
Yes, I am.
Okay, so how, like, to looking forward now, like how has your psychedelic use and perspective shifted how you parent or how you want to parent or
Oh yeah. Um, well, my child is 14 now, and it's interesting because I saw the other day there was an article I came across that was about microdosing for parents, and it was all about helping parents get to that point where you see the world in that childlike wonder so that you can
yeah.
get on the same page and relate to your child. And I, without a doubt, feel like my, time spent with psychedelics, when I was younger, a young adult, and, I'm sure you hear this all the time, like, once you've done it a couple of times, you don't, it's to the point where you don't even need to take it to get to that level of awareness and appreciation.
Mhm.
So, when my kid was 2 and he was staring at a bug going across the, sidewalk, I was right there with him on the ground being like, "That's
Yeah.
so cool," and being able to take that, hyper awareness and, and just the world is an amazing place. So yeah, I mean, I think when he was younger, I was a fun mom, because I was able to, and climbing trees and just
Mhm.
communing with nature and just kind of looking at the world with like that childlike wonder because it's when it's brand new to you, it's just kind of amazing. And
Yeah.
I often like being around young children, I'm like it really is like they're all on acid.
Oh, yeah, yeah. They're just perma tripping for
Yeah,
like those first many years until they become like, hit that like 6 or 7, they can
yeah,
become real self aware and all of a sudden are like, wait a minute, I'm a
yeah,
human being having a
yeah,
human experience, ground down.
yeah, exactly. But the interesting thing, so I did psychedelics, practice with psychedelics from like 17 to 19. And then, through my 20s and 30s, I didn't touch psychedelics at all. I was a professional singer and I was, in a rock band and, kind of did that. And I didn't drink a lot. I didn't party. I was just kind of, it wasn't that I didn't feel like I needed, the psychedelics anymore. It just kind of wasn't part. And it wasn't even like, oh, that's for when I was a kid. Now I'm grown up and I have everything figured out. Although that's what 20 people in their 20s think. And I probably was no different. But, like my husband at the time, like it wasn't like something that he would do. So it just kind of naturally drifted out of my lens of using it as a life tool. Fast forward, like the last time I took it, I was probably 20. And then fast forward 20 years to when I was 40. And, my ex husband and I broke up, and I had this young, child at the time who was like 3 or so. And I met my partner now that I've been with for the last 12 years. And he's a little bit younger than me and was very into, utilizing LSD and psilocybin for, like helping with depression and, just mind expansion, the whole thing. And about 6 or 7 months after we started dating, said, would you consider, you know, having a trip with me? And I was like, wow, I haven't thought about this in 20 years, and I had a lot of apprehension about it because I remember, the LSD from that I took in the 90s is a lot different than, what's out there now. Um, and I had a
How
lot
so?
of,
I want to hear about that.
ah, The number one thing that I noticed was how much cleaner it is. When we
Now versus then,
Yes,
or yeah.
yes,
Oh, okay. Okay.
yes. And I mean, when we were taking it in the early 90s, we would have to smoke so much weed to counterbalance the effects of the speediness and
Okay.
we used to call it strychnine back, because you'd start getting this ache in your lower back. And like I'm not a chemist, I don't even know,
Yeah.
but they used to say that strychnine was like rat poison and that they used it in LSD or whatever. So it really took a physical toll. It was also, I
Mhm.
feel like it was a lot, not that I ever did any big trips. I never did more than like one hit. I was never one of those people who was just like, let's just full on.
Yeah.
But
Look
it
on it.
really took, yeah, even at a young age. Like I remember the next day, the next couple of days, just feeling very sore, feeling very dehydrated. And, I was absolutely thrilled when I revisited this, 20 years later. And I think it was 25I maybe that we had taken. But it was, cleaner, no back issues. It was a shorter duration of trip. It wasn't like
Mhm.
a, 10 to 12 hour, journey. It was more like a 6 to 8. I also found it was kind of interesting. Um, I almost got the sense that the chemists were kind of like back then we didn't have like these like full day festivals. Like you
Mhm.
went to a show, you saw an opening band, you saw a band, the main band, that was it.
Yeah.
And now it's like, like you have these festivals where it's just all day, all night, one band after another. And it, not that it was the newer acid is speedy, but it definitely felt more, I felt more awake and it felt more like it was specifically engineered for people who want to go to these festivals and who want to have
Mhm.
that
To keep
energy.
going.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Keep going and keep going and keep going. Yeah.
Yeah. Watch the
Um,
sun come up.
yeah. I think that the greatest thing about, revisiting it after all those years, and again, I was even afraid to look in the mirror, because I was like, okay, now like I don't have the acne anymore. Now I've got wrinkles, now I'm in
Yeah.
my early 40s. And am I going to look at myself and am I going to see this crone in front of me, And I remember the first time, taking it and, we were sitting outside for the most part. It was winter and I came inside to use the bathroom and I was like, I'm going to look. And I looked at myself in the mirror and my cheeks were flushed from being outside and I looked happy and I looked light. And I remember doing this like really cheesy, like in the mirror, like you're good. Like, but at the time, especially while I was on the trip, it was very cathartic
Yeah.
to revisit that mirror all those years later and to absolutely love the person that I've become
Mhm.
and be very, very comfortable in my own skin.
Oh, that's really cool. That's a
Yeah,
sweet, sweet sentiment. I
yeah,
love that.
absolutely. Absolutely. And um, I've been able to, I think, as an older adult, now when I was in my 40s and started using it again, and primarily just, LSD and psilocybin, starting pre-integration, of what do you want to do, what's your goal going into this, and not every single time. Sometimes it's like whatever is going to present to me is going to present to me, and I'll integrate afterwards. And again, until the last year when I started learning, I never used the word integrate. I knew that that's what I was doing, but I didn't know that. So it blows my mind to realize that this is a movement and this is something that's helping people. And I hear, I listen to podcasts and interviews all the time when people who are big in this industry, and when asked like, oh, do you have experience? And people say, oh yeah, I kind of messed around with it in college. And again, I just, I'm just, wow, I'm amazed that I had the opportunity to do this at such a young age and to do it the right way.
Well, it sounds like, I mean, yeah, that's like a that's crazy to begin with, as we kind of talked about. Like most teenagers that are getting their hands on psychedelics are, it's just it's the circumstance. Kids are hiding stuff from parents. They don't have places to go. a lot of times alcohol is involved or not the right environment. So it's a recipe for disaster for a lot of young minds. So it is fantastic that you had such positive experiences. Um, have you ever encountered very challenging experiences, either in your youth or since you kind of picked it back up again? And like, what have those been more like, or what did you take away from the more challenging experiences?
Yeah, for sure. Actually, I was thinking about this because again, I've been doing a lot of research and like, considering training to be an integration coach or facilitator. And it's really kind of pulled me back to, the times when I was younger of what, harm reduction experiences or anything like that. And I do have a specific, two times, but one specifically where my boyfriend at the time, who was a little bit younger than me, I was 18, so he was maybe 17, and he had never done LSD before, and he wanted to try it. So we did it. And I'd been with him at that point for 7 or 8 months or so. So it wasn't brand new. Um, and and as you know, like, if you are doing psychedelic medicine with someone who's new for the first time, they're going to be on a very different level than, and I understood this going
It's like
into
a responsibility almost that
yes,
you're taking on.
what I wasn't prepared for. So he got very freaked out, very weird. And we ended up going into my bedroom, and he needed to have the whole entire room dark. Like at the time we had like, like digital clock radios, and he couldn't even have that. Like the light was hurting his eyes. He started confiding in me that he had been molested by a neighbor.
Oh my God.
And number one, I was on, the same amount of trip as he was, and
Yeah.
18. So, not much older than him. This was the first time in my life that I ever had anyone confide in me, that they had been abused. And so this was brand new, LSD or not, like this was
Yeah,
brand new.
yeah, exactly. Yeah. You're
And
both
again,
kids still
yeah,
at this point. Like, yeah.
exactly. And again, also in the early 90s, where talking about this kind of sexual abuse was not normalized at all, especially for men and young boys. And he, went into great detail of not, like graphic detail, but his big struggle was that, it was a neighbor, and, he was around 12 or so, and it was very confusing to him because he didn't push it away, and his body was
Yeah.
reacting one way. And so, and then at old, so he was very conflicted, and this was all coming up, and he wasn't expecting it to come up. I don't think he necessarily was planning on ever telling me.
Had
um
he ever told anyone at this point, or this is,
I can't remember.
yeah,
I
yeah,
can't
yeah.
remember.
Nonetheless, it's like
Yeah, yeah,
a big moment for his
absolutely.
psyche.
Yeah, absolutely. And it was interesting to me because again, this is 30 over 30 years, 30 some years ago. And it was, and in the last couple of months since I've been, really immersed in educating myself of this, it was that memory came up, and I went, holy crap, I totally forgot about that moment. And wow, I actually was, you know, I was facilitating, at that
Right.
time, and under the influence too. Was it cathartic for him? I don't know. I don't know. He never. I ended up. He and I ended up breaking up because he ended up, developing some addictions, and that stemmed from the abuse.
Of
And
course.
yeah, but that was intense, and it was intense for him, I'm sure, and it was intense for me because it was not anything that I had ever experienced.
Yeah, that I mean, oh my gosh, blindsided, I'm sure. I've only encountered one experience like that myself. I was at a music festival and we're setting up camp. Everybody's like, this will be way more fun on LSD, of course. Um and I got kind of pulled away by my boyfriend's best friend, who I had gotten to know over the past year and whatnot. But again, like, we're friends. We party together, and he was having a complete mental and emotional breakdown and needed to talk to somebody. And I mean, it was all the stuff. I don't know. He was just getting hit with the waves of whatever he had also consumed. But it was, I mean, we're going back to basics here. Am I a good person? Will I ever be able to figure my life out? I'm not sure my parents even really love me. I don't think I'm good at college. He was just, it was a melt. It caught me so off guard. I didn't know. Again, I'm also high. We're at this very loud, chaotic situation, but it almost sobered me up in a sense where I was like, okay, I'm okay. Like, I'm all right. I feel emotionally grounded. So I need to just listen and be. I think there's an interesting thing that happens where when you're taking psychedelics in any group situation, anybody may need to have some integration skills at any point in time, right? Whether you need to learn how to just listen or help somebody find a safe space, or that's an important part, I think, of if you're going to be tripping with others. There's some soft skills that are really valuable to have to know.
Well, and it's interesting too, because in my doula training, one of my biggest lessons and takeaways from my training was the art of deep active listening. And that was such a hard rewire for me because I'm a conversationalist. Like I can have a genuine conversation with just about any kind of human being almost immediately. And I'm very good at filling in those spaces. And I realized that one of the reasons why I got really good at it is because of my own feeling of uncomfort in that silence. It's not even about the person, I mean, it is about making the person feel more comfortable, but it's also about, my personal comfort. And I didn't like those awkward silences. So in my doula training, I had to learn how to embrace those awkward silences because when you're sitting with people who are looking at, end of life and actively dying, a lot of them have cognitive delays. I mean, you're talking about something that's very difficult to articulate. And so you have to provide big spaces for the opportunity for them to, process and then verbalize if they so choose to. And so I see the same skill that is needed, in facilitating and integration as well.
In your death doula work, which I just learned about what that term actually meant like a handful of years back, and was so fascinated by the fact that this service exists, because a lot of people die alone. I mean, we all die alone, but you know what I mean.
Mhm.
Um, and then starting to consider like any kind of psychedelic component in that, and like just the research that we're starting to come up with about especially psilocybin, helping people find some sort of peace, come to terms with not only leaving this physical realm but releasing fear about what's going to happen next, et cetera, et cetera. Are you What kind of conversations, if you could share, are you having with people as they near death? Like, tell me a little bit about some of the mental state or the biggest fears, or what sort of peace people are finding as they're nearing the end of this life.
Yeah. Um, I think the overall, like the most prevalent thing, I think most people that I've worked with are pretty okay with tapping out and leaving and at peace with it. Their main concern, and I think it's something that often takes them by surprise, is they didn't take into consideration that they'd have to leave the people who are living behind, and that what kind of pain that was going to create for them. And I see that struggle a lot. My first hospice patient that I ever sat with, as shortly after my doula training, the first thing, she didn't even know that I was doula trained. She just figured I was a hospice volunteer, so she didn't know what capacity I could help her with. But I walked into her room and I sat down, and she had Parkinson's, and she was maybe like in her early 70s, and she straight up said, nobody wants to talk to me about the fact that I'm dying and that I'm coming close. And she said, not my family, not my children, not even my doctors will talk to me about this. And it was just, heart-wrenching because I could feel that she was very lonely in this need, to want to articulate her feelings, her regrets. She was a deeply religious person. So I think she had some fear about where she was going afterwards. But mostly just she wanted to make sure that her children, would be okay. And I think that that's a very common one, and it's something that even if you can be super evolved and you understand, like this is my time, even, people at the very end of a very full life in their 80s and 90s, they still, that takes them by surprise of like, oh, right, I'm ready to go, but I'm not ready to leave you
Mm.
like this. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see that. That's yeah, absolutely. Oh, that is heartbreaking. And I wondered too, like, gosh, I interviewed a woman a few weeks ago that was talking about the power of MDMA therapy and how that's been so valuable for her in her life. And she had said something about, I can't imagine leaving this earth without having done MDMA with my entire immediate family. She's like, I just sense that there is something about our connection or the way that we will be able to let go or part ways as our family changes, passes on, and evolves, that something about that psychedelic experience would heal. Which I'm like, gosh, could you even imagine if that started to become something more normalized, even in like an end of life situation, even if we're talking, just something that, I don't know, can strengthen a family unit, in strengthen it so that it can pass on a little more peacefully, or
Yeah.
evolve.
Yeah, absolutely. And I definitely see it as a possibility, in the future. Um, and again, using psychedelic therapy at end of life, to ease anxiety and just kind of, at like a final review wrap up sort of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah.
And I think that, we're getting ready. I'm also, because of the doula stuff and the hospice volunteer stuff, like I'm very like about ageism and understanding that we're getting ready to, the baby boomers are getting ready to be geriatric. And so we're going to see an influx in senior citizens, and we're going to see an influx in Alzheimer's. I mean, not only are we having more geriatric people, but as we are further, you know, learning the mind and gut connection, and we're seeing more, cases of Alzheimer's. So, more dementia, uh, and I feel that the boomers generation, they're going to want to do things differently than their parents. And they're also one of the first generations that are not strangers to psychedelics. I mean, not that,
Right.
every person who's getting ready to turn 70, went to Woodstock and,
Right.
like
Yeah.
did LSD in the 60s, but I think that I think they're gonna want something different. And so I could see them. And plus they're also a generation that has watched, cannabis, become a modern medicine.
Right.
So I think they're
Right.
gonna be much more open to the idea of utilizing psychedelic therapy. I hope so.
Yeah, I hope so too. I hope so too. Yeah, there's definitely a little bit of a gap in perhaps some of their experience, but again, just like you said, exposure, seeing
Mhm.
how things have changed, maybe watching their children and grandchildren, being more open about medical and therapeutic uses. It's not just like this recreational thing anymore. We have legitimate concrete studies coming out of some of the most major research centers across the globe. So, you know, I think a lot of boomer generation is still kind of a pill popping generation, or like, well, the doctor said, well, this, well, it's like, okay, if we can continue to legitimize and research, hopefully we can offer some alternative ways to age better,
Yeah, absolutely. And
live
then
better.
it's interesting too, because on the other side of things, talking about this with you today about my early experiences, I think it presents a really interesting challenge for the psychedelic therapy community to for young people who are starting to experiment, and probably in a very, you know, not in clinical settings, in a personal
Right.
way. How do we educate them to utilize this medicine in a way that benefits them? Like I want every single 18-year-old to experience it in a way that I did.
Oh,
Um,
yeah.
and
I
it's
know.
ironic because I talked with a childhood friend of mine last week. She lives in Colorado, and she is the one that I did LSD with for the first time when we were 17. And I told her about, was going to be doing this show and that I was going to be talking about my early experiences. And I said to her, I said, did you ever think about the fact that because we were able to integrate this into our lives, I mean, our brains weren't even fully developed yet. And we were incorporating this and weaving this into, the fabric of our being. It's made us who we are, and that it's made us into the people that we are, and she was just like, holy crap. It was like this super aha moment for her, she was like, I didn't even think about that. She's like, I didn't even think about, she's like, and how are we so lucky? How did we know how to use it? I'm like, I don't know, but lucky that we did.
Yeah, yeah,
it
absolutely.
it would be cool to figure out a way to educate young people so that they're not the 40-50 year olds that are going to these retreats, that they can, and dealing with damage, like, because decades later, like, wouldn't it be cool if they
Yeah.
could integrate this into their lives in a very healthy and safe sort of way?
Yeah, I'm curious what teens of today and of tomorrow will think of psychedelics. Like I have my stepdaughter's 15, and um just kind of like looking at her peers. Obviously this is a small sample, but they're really like, weed is not cool because
Mhm.
their parents, everybody's parents smoke weed, and it's legal and it's around and it's just like visible, and so they're like, that's dumb. Who cares? Like, why would you? That doesn't make sense to them. um and obviously she knows like what I do for work, and I'm talking a lot about psychedelic, it's safe use in the home and all of these other things. And um I get a lot of eye rolls of like, I think maybe in her mind she might be thinking, oh, you're just trying to find a nice way to use drugs or make it you know what I mean. I think she's just kind of like, okay, Holly, like, sure, whatever. And I'm over here like, she was working on a veteran project. It's something at school about veterans and PTSD for her psychology course. And I was telling her about ibogaine and ketamine and some of the research I'd come across and the people I'd talked to. And
Mm.
she was like, I'm not going to go give a presentation at school and talk about drugs. I'm like, but that's not, and I was like, okay, like, I totally understand where
Yeah.
you're coming from.
Yeah.
And talk therapy isn't the solution for the veterans that you're talking about, but it's just like, there's still a little bit of a gap, at least in her peer group. And I'm wondering at what point will that shift, or if it ever will. Or yeah, I'm just curious. I'm curious how kids today will be brought up viewing these substances, and if they will get those like beautiful experiences out camping under the stars with their friends, or if we medicalize it too quickly and they're just like, oh yeah, it's just some therapy thing that is an option. I don't know. I don't know what will happen.
Right.
I
Right.
hope we all get everybody gets experiences like you did, and it feels safe and happy and expansive and something that's like a core memory with their friends.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, one of the first times I had a friend of mine who was very heavily into the dead scene, and this was when I was new to the whole, LSD and psilocybin space, and she told me about a friend of hers, and again, we were all 17, 18, who would specifically take acid, and this girl had been doing it since she was like 14 or 15 years old. She would specifically take acid when she had a problem that she needed to
Oh,
figure out.
okay.
And at the time, and again, I mean, in hindsight, I can look back and I can see that I utilized psychedelic in a very good way. But I watched the curtains breathe. I spun
Oh
around
yeah,
in a circle and,
sure.
mindlessly, to music and whatnot.
Uh-huh.
But at the time, I remember thinking that is the craziest idea I've ever heard. And why would you go into your trip as a downer?
Yeah.
And now I look back at it and I'm like, man, I need to find out what happened to that girl. Like,
Yeah, she had some balls. Like that's, honestly, like good on her. Yeah. What-
but again, it's all about, I think it's about how you are exposed to it. And,
Mhm.
and because we were exposed to it by a lot of older heads, and not far from people who were doing it in the, 60s, um, that they kind of shepherded, is that a word, shepherded,
Yeah,
uh,
yeah.
into,
Yes.
us into that place. But even then, I mean, even without them, I think, we figured it out on our own. And I would love, like you were just saying, I would love to be able to see kids utilize it for that.
Yeah. Yeah, agreed. Yeah, I'm hopeful. And maybe with the education that we're able to offer and how it's becoming less taboo. So hopefully that makes things feel more accessible and safe. And, we
Yeah.
have cleaner substances. And I hope it becomes like common practice. Like nowadays at music festivals, there's a lot of like, hey, free test kits over here, like come over here, we know you're doing drugs.
Yeah.
Like everybody's doing drugs. Why don't we make sure that what you're doing is safe? Like no judgment here, bring it on by. I love that. Like that's
Yeah.
so amazing.
Yeah.
Or just knowing that, like, especially at festivals, we've got dance safe and all these other organizations and the Zendo project, like, hey, things are taking a weird turn for you, or you lost your friends, or it's feeling scary, or you realize you didn't drink water today, like come here, we can take care of you and make sure things are okay
Yeah.
and help. I love that so much. I love
Yeah.
that those types of things exist as well. Which kids are probably going to always do drugs and experiment. I just want them to have the best experiences they possibly can when they're doing it. So
Absolutely.
they end up like you and on this awesome path of life. And then revisit it 20 years later with like out hesitation or fear or whatever. And just like, yeah,
Yeah.
totally. I'm down
Yeah.
to do this again.
Yeah. Well, I wouldn't say there was no hesitation
And
or fear. I definitely, again, I would say I was like mildly apprehensive about it
fair,
because,
fair.
and also looking at it like, okay, I'm now a grown ass adult and I'm a mother and, getting ready to go through a divorce and I have adult problems. Whereas
Yeah,
the
yeah.
last time I visited this place, I didn't. And,
True. Very true.
and how is that going to impact my experience on the trip? And again, it was, but I was like, all right, well, I guess we're going to find out. And
Yeah.
then to really be like, to hear that voice that, be like, everything's right on time. You're doing great. Everything's right on time.
Mm,
Moving, this is good medicine for you to explore and, and to kind of have perspective and keep going, keep moving forward.
yeah. Gosh, that's a powerful way to frame it too. Like, yeah, looking back, I didn't really have challenging trips in my youth, but I didn't have big adult problems
Yeah.
that are harder to tackle or mentally mull through as an adult. That's a powerful point.
Yeah. And again, that's why I was thinking how advantageous it would be for young adults to be able to utilize psychedelic medicine in a way, before they get all those layers of wonderful life damage and those that
Yeah.
we wear, as a badge of honor,
Yeah.
of living
Yeah.
and getting the privilege of living.
Hmm.
Um, and to be able, because it, not only do they have less that they have to work through, but it kind of, you know, it changes the pathways of the brain so that when those things start happening, they're dealing with it differently.
Yeah. Yeah. Different kind of reverence for life and our part in it. Hopefully, more of a lightheartedness is
Yeah.
kind of what I also,
Yeah.
consider to be a big bonus of some of those early experiences
Yeah.
too.
Because it wasn't until I had that conversation last week with my, friend who I had started, doing psychedelics with, and she had that aha moment, and then that kind of like, pinged me to really think about. I just thought that I, had led this unconventional life and had this unconventional way of looking at the world and the universe because I'm me, and but how much of that potentially was because of my very healthy and safe use of psychedelics at a young age, and how did that shape my mind and my perspective on things so that the next, the trajectory of my life unfolded the way that it did.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Mm. Oh, I love that. I love this story. This has been a really great conversation.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for letting me, share some of. Again, it's difficult because I don't have a lot of spaces to be able to share this sort of thing with people, and it's been nice, and I'm grateful that you guys create this opportunity for people to do it.
Oh, we love it. I also think too, like, just having these conversations helps people integrate experiences they had that maybe they haven't thought about in a really long time, or that they, again, just haven't told somebody something before. And I love doing this because there's always sparks for me that do the same thing. Like, I'm continually like integrating and learning, and that's just, you know, one of the great blessings of the human experience, to be able to share our stories and receive others' stories. So thank you for your openness to share, and for meeting with me today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me.